Good evening, students, and welcome to the last installment of our Civil War lectures, part 4. Once again, today I would like you to focus on the generals, saying who is in charge and how successful were they are, the battles, who won, who lost, what tactics were employed, and what was the significance, and then lastly, once again, the strategies that were employed during these battles. Thank you very much, and please enjoy. This evening we will be discussing the end of the American Civil War and how the Union forces were finally able to close out Southern forces. The last portion of the war came down to two generals, Robert E. Lee for the Confederacy and Ulysses S. Grant for the North. Both of these men had fought for most of the entire war viciously, not against each other. Lee had been more or less dominant against Union forces in the Eastern Theater, while Grant had been more or less dominant against Confederate forces in the Western Theater. Well, finally, in the end, Lincoln put Grant in charge of all Union forces in the East in an attempt to destroy Lee once and for all. After Gettysburg, the Eastern Campaign consisted of one goal and one goal only: chasing down Robert E. Lee's Northern Army of Northern Virginia and completely and thoroughly destroying them. This was what we would call a war of attrition, meaning who could outlast who. In this case, Grant had superior numbers, nearly twice as many, with a force of upwards of 120,000, superior resources, and superior technology to Lee's vastly dwindling numbers of roughly 30,000 soldiers. Now, Abraham Lincoln names Ulysses S. Grant the commander of all Union armies at the beginning of 1864. In his turn, Grant places his right hand, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, in command of the Western armies. Grant takes up the mantle of total war. This means that the Union Army will not only destroy the Confederate forces, but they will destroy the Confederacy itself by taking out all economic interests and essentially everything that could be aided in using to create a war effort in an attempt to end the war. Grant decided on a three-pronged total war approach. He would use General Philip Sheridan to destroy the Shenandoah Valley and destroy all farms, what we would call a scorched earth policy. He himself would go after Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia and eventually take Richmond, and then he would send William Tecumseh Sherman on a march from Atlanta all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, destroying everything in his path. Grant's battles against Lee were not about outflanking him or outmaneuvering him, but essentially they were about destroying him, using the Union Army as a battering ram, not worried about casualties, knowing that the quicker he could destroy the Army of Northern Virginia, that in the end, the more lives would be saved. This approach was generally successful, eventually pinning down the Confederate Army with the siege at Petersburg, which they would engage in for over 9 months. After moving through Tennessee, slicing up Confederate forces along the way, William Tecumseh Sherman eventually takes the hub city of Atlanta, the terminus of all Southern railroads. Once Atlanta falls, Sherman burns it to the ground. From Atlanta, Sherman would take a march to the Atlantic Ocean. From Atlanta to the Atlantic Ocean, he would march without supply lines. His orders were for his men to forage off the ground, meaning essentially any food that was available to them, they would eat. Anything that they could use from plantation houses, they would take. They were to use everything the South had to offer. And in this way, they would break down the economic and the spiritual backbone of the South. Sherman and his men would march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, about 250 miles, and essentially destroying every plantation, every farm, every home that they came across. Their number one goal, was to make the South uninhabitable and to destroy infrastructure. The railroads got it worse, where the men would tear up the tracks, heat them, and then tie them around trees. Sherman's neckties, as they became called, can still be found throughout Georgia today. Many soldiers in Sherman's regiment found the march to the sea as the absolute best time of their lives. A nice break from 4 years of continuous fighting, and most of them ate better on this march than they had ever eaten in their entire lives. And the sheer destruction was complete fun to them, destroying the forces that had made their lives roughly hell for the last 4 years. While it was fantastic for Union forces, for Southern forces, Sherman's march to the sea meant the absolute end. The destruction of their way of life, the destruction of their homes, the destruction of everything that they held dear and would ever hold dear. Eventually, the siege at Petersburg ends, and with this end opens up a clear line for the Union forces to take Richmond, Virginia. Lee's army was thinned by desertion and casualties, and was by this point in time roughly a quarter the size of Grant's army. The Confederate capital would fall to the 25th Cavalry Corps, a almost entirely black cavalry unit, which was a supreme embarrassment to them. With the Confederate capital in ruins, Lee vowed to continue to fight. However, after roughly a week, Lee was finally ran to ground by the Union Army and decided that he would surrender on April 9th, 1865, in the Virginia town of Appomattox Courthouse. The meeting would take place between Grant and Lee in a small farmhouse in the country town. Grant, out of a sign of respect to Lee and his service to the United States military, and allowing for a peaceful fold of the Confederacy back into the Union, allowed Lee to keep his saber and his horse, and allowed his men to keep their arms as long as they promised not to fight. After 4 years of extremely bloody warfare, Lee's men were simply told to go home to their families. With nearly estimates of 800,000 dead, the Civil War would be the bloodiest conflict America would ever take part in. Summary: please summarize your notes and explain how the North was able to defeat the South during the Civil War.